Hello everyone. Today we will see about the analytical study design. This is chapter 6, analytic study design. This is lecture outline. So in this unit we will cover case control study design, cohort study design, and experimental study design. So these designs are very basic designs which is very essential to operate our daily lives. So this is our learning objectives. Study design. This is analytic study design is the second major type of epidemiology which is encountered with analyzing the cause of determinant of disease. So the first type of epidemiology is descriptive study, descriptive epidemiology, and analytic is a study, the second major type of epidemiology, which is concerned with analyzing the cause or determinants of disease. So the purpose or the aim of analytic study design is the first one is to test hypothesis about causal relationship. Analytic study design is testing the hypothesis about causal relationship, whereas descriptive study design is generating hypothesis. And the other aim of analytic study design is to search for causes and effect, and to compare treatment regimes and prevention programs, to quantify the association between exposure and outcome, focus on determinants of disease by testing hypotheses. Are exposure and disease linked? Ask questions like are exposure and disease linked? So exposure, study about how exposure is linked with the disease. So time frame of studies. There are two time frame of studies. The one is prospective study, the other retrospective study. So prospective study looks forward, while retrospective study looks back or looks backward. And prospective study looks to the future, examine future events, follows a condition, concern disease into the future. So prospective study by getting some conditions, it will follow to some duration or to some period of time to the future, while a retrospective study looks back in that time to study events that have already occurred. So they have already occurred, so we will come back in time and we will study events which occur in the previous time, but respective study have also the follow-up time by starting from the previous and following up to the present time. So prospective and retrospective are two time frame of studies which is applied in study. So prospective versus retrospective study. In prospective study, outcomes has not occurred at the beginning of the study. So there is only exposure or susceptibility or any factor at the beginning of study, but the outcome of the condition or the outcome of that risk factor is still not occurred at the beginning of study. So since the outcome is not occurred at the beginning of study, we will follow the risk factors. We will follow that individuals or conditions, and we will get an event or we will get an outcome of the follow-up or for that condition. So there is exposure here, and there is time in the future, and the start of study is here. So start of study is here. So if you starting study here, and by collecting individuals here, and if you follow up for the future, this is the prospective study. So the outcome is in the future. But in the case of retrospective study, the outcome is already occurred. So individuals go back in time, and we will collect these exposures here, and we will follow the outcome in the future up to the current time. So we want to identify or study the conditions, but the condition or the outcome of studies have already happened or occurred. So this is the present or the current time. So from the current time in the future, it will be prospective. From the current time, if you study back in time, it is retrospective study or historical study. So two types of analytic studies. The one is observational studies, the other is interventional studies. So in the case of observational studies, the investigator simply observe the occurrence of conditions. Whereas that means does not intervene. This is observational studies. Interventional studies, in the case of interventional studies, the investigator has a power to manipulate or to determine the exposure. So this is if the investigator is intervene on conditions more than observation, this is known as interventional studies, or you can say experimental studies. So the investigator power is the difference between observation and interventional studies. So for example, in case of interventional studies, randomized control trial or experimental study. In the case of observational studies, it will be cross-section sometimes, and case control and cohort are considered as in observational studies. Observational studies, an investigator observes the natural course of an event, simply observe what is happened in the nature. So an investigator measures but does not intervene. That means an investigator has ability to measure what is happening, but does not intervene the exposure or in measurements. The other is interventional studies. In interventional studies, an investigator assigns the study subjects to exposed and non-exposed by himself, and follows to measure for disease occurrence. So an investigator manipulates the intervention. So has the ability to assign individuals to exposed and non-exposed group, and to follow for the future whether the outcome of interest has been whether will be occurred or not. So an investigator manipulates the intervention. So observational analytic studies. The commonest types of observational analytic studies are case control study design, cohort study design, and cross-sectional studies. So this is the commonest. So especially the most common one is case control and cohort. Cohort is observational analytic studies, but cross-sectional also observational. So having this concept, now we will see about the case control study design. So case control study design. In case control study design, cases and controls are compared for their exposure status. So the investigator will select the cases who have the outcome of interest, and will select controls who are free from the disease or outcome of interest, and these two things are compared for previous exposure status. So whether these cases are exposed or non-exposed, whether controls are exposed or non-exposed, are considered in the case control study. It assesses retrospectively on exposure status. So at present time, the investigator will select cases and controls, and will go back respectively to compare or to assess exposure status. It is relatively cheaper, and measure of association is odds ratio. So this is cases. Cases means people with disease or people with the outcome of interest. So we will see back in time whether these cases are exposed or non-exposed. And also we will control, we will have controls, people without disease, free of disease. So we will compare exposed and non-exposed. So at when the individual starts with, when an investigator starting one's study, he will select cases and controls, and both are compared for their exposed, non-exposed, exposed, non-exposed. So this time is at present time. So direction of inquiry, in case this is past in time, so meaning the direction of inquiries will be in the past. So so time is this is past, this is present, but we will go in the previous. So we will study for previous, direction of study here. The other is the same thing, time is this, direction of inquiries in the for previous. So here is a population. In the population we will select cases and we will select controls. So cases are compared for non-exposed and exposed, and controls are compared for exposed and non-exposed, non-exposed. So case control design is select groups of subjects with disease, that is cases, and try to characterize their pre-disease exposure status, whether they are exposed or not. And select group of subjects without disease, that is controls, and try to characterize their exposure status. We have seen in the diagram. So compare how common exposure was among cases with how common it was among controls. So as measure of exposure disease association. So outcome in case control study. Outcome is a case control study. Can we study outcome other than disease? Yes. The outcome has traditionally been the presence or absence of disease. When considered presence of disease, it is cases. Absence of disease is controls traditionally. However, other outcomes can be studied, maybe disability, disabled or non-disabled, smoking cessation, smoker or non-smoker. We can use also other than disease. So this is an outcome. This one is also for exposure. And selection of cases, how we select cases in control study design may be selected from hospitals, that is hospital based cases, and may be selected from the population, general population, that is known as population based cases. When we see by the way, when we see hospital based cases, when we are selecting the cases for the study in the hospital, it will be easy and inexpensive to conduct, because you will get disease in the hospital and you will get controls in the hospital, so it will be easy and inexpensive to conduct. Prone to selection bias. So more likely cooperative, reduce non-response bias in the hospital, since they are found in the hospitals and they need care from physicians or health professions. So when they ask them, they will be cooperative. So reduce non-response bias. So selection bias means in the hospital may not be those diseases may not be representative of the general population. So when we are selecting in cases from the population, this is avoided selection bias. Because the cases are found on the population, so they are representative. Allows the description of disease in the entire population, allows the description of disease entire population. So when you are selecting the cases in the population, so that cases or individuals will represent the population, will represent or will describe the population. Direct calculation of rates are possible. Direct calculation of rates are possible in the case of population cases. Rates are possible, and also it is generalizable. Generalizable, since it is estimated from general population, so it will be generalizable. So population based cases are more important, but it will be more costly. But most of the time population based study is more costly. It is costly and not easy, since it is in general population. It is difficult to get their cooperativity, and also it's very expensive. So this is the difference between cases. So advantages of case control. In general, advantages of case control is relatively cheap and cost effective as compared to cohort, relatively quick and simple to carry out, efficient for rare diseases. So when the diseases when the prevalence of diseases are rare, or when the number of diseases are rare, case control is efficient, and can study several exposure, examine multiple factors for single disease. So can study several exposure for single disease. Usually requires a small study population than cohort study. As compared to the cohort, smaller population may be sufficient or enough to get sufficient amount or finding. So this is an advantage. Disadvantage: cannot yield a population level measure of disease incidence or prevalence. Cannot yield population level of measure of disease incidence and prevalence. So this is if cases and controls are selected from the hospital. They will not show population level measure of incidence. Not suitable for rare exposure. They are suitable for rare disease, but not suitable for rare exposure. For rare exposure is important cohort. So prone to selection or recall bias, since mostly case controls are performed in the hospital. Selection bias may happen, and also recall bias is the most common selection bias, because recall bias, because since exposures are asked, individuals are asked for exposure previously or go back in time, recall bias may happen. So some exposures may ask for more than 2 years in the previous time. So recall bias meaning when asking exposure for previous time, whether that individual may remember them all exposures. So recall bias may be introduced in the case control study. No calculation of rates and risks possible. In case of rates and in case of case control study design, rates and risks are not possible. Calculating rates and risks are possible. In case of case control study design, there is some exception for advanced case control study or others like matched case control study, but for this study, rates and risks are not possible. Temporal exposure disease uncertainty. Since exposures are not followed, some uncertainty will be happened. In some situations, temporal relationship between exposure disease may be difficult to establish. That means temporal exposure disease uncertainty means the same. So this is a disadvantage. So measure of association of case control studies: odds ratio. Odds means the chance of something happening, or the probability of an event happening over the probability of an event not happening. So that means the probability of happening is p, the probability of not happening is 1 minus p. So odds ratio means odds of disease in exposed over odds of disease in unexposed. So in another word, odds of disease in exposed means p over 1 minus p. Odds of disease in unexposed also will be similar. So odds ratio means odds of disease in exposed population and odds of disease in unexposed population. This odds. So odds ratio is equal to 1 is null hypothesis. So in the case of case control, if odds ratio is greater than 1, is equal to 1, it's null hypothesis. Null hypothesis means there is no association between exposure and disease. So if in case of you are studying in case of case control study, if the finding is odds ratio finding is becomes 1, there is no association between exposure and outcome or disease. When odds ratio greater than 1, it should be risk factor. So the exposure or the risk factor will be risk factor for a disease. That means that risk factor will lead the development of the disease if odds ratio greater than 1. Odds ratio less than 1, it is prospective. It is protective factor. So if odds ratio becomes less than 1, the risk factor is does not lead to the outcome or the disease. Or protective factor means even will reduce the outcome or the development of the disease. So less than 1 means a protective factor. So the three thing is very important. So the odds ratio may have the three outcomes, either equal to 1 or less than 1 or greater than 1. So consider this one. When we are sample, this is predictors of congenital anomalies. So this is a case control study. By the way, case control study divided into two. There are two types. It is unmatched case control study and matched case control study. So this study is unmatched case control study. So it's a multi-center institution-based case control study. That means unmatched case control study was conducted. So the outcome of this study is the presence and absence of congenital anomaly. So this study consider people with individuals with congenital anomaly, or newborns with congenital anomaly and newborns without congenital anomaly. So the newborn mothers were asked about exposure or risk factors, So they compared congenital anomaly for exposed and non-exposed. Individual without congenital anomaly asked for exposure and non-exposure, like exposures like alcohol. So mothers having newborns with congenital anomaly asked whether she was drinking alcohol or not, and mothers without congenital anomaly were asking for whether she was drinking alcohol or not, like this. So if you want to do unmatched case control study, you can do just like this as a sample. This is a sample study. So this is today's section. So in the next video we will start about case control cohort study design. So don't forget to subscribe this channel to get the next videos. Have a nice time. Bye.